Good morning and welcome to this vivid event, Neuroscience, the Imagination and the Workplace. My name is Kelly-Ann Denton and I'm the Director of Creative Learning at Imagineer.me. This is Professor David Alais of Sydney University, and we have been working together since last year to explore and define what the imagination is and where it actually functions in the brain. So we feel very fortunate to have the time to bring this to you this morning, and we're also very grateful that you are here on time, so thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here so bright and early. We know you're all very busy people, and we know that you've got many demands on your time, and you've made a choice to come down here, and we appreciate that very much. And in return, we're going to give you, I think, a very interesting and informative presentation on the imagination viewed from, on the one hand, an educational, artistic point of view, and on the other hand, a neuroscience point of view, which together adds up to a very complete picture of what the imagination is, helps us to understand what it is. And our goal really is to describe the imagination fully from both those perspectives and talk about ways we can access the imagination, ways that we can train it up, and then ways that we can exploit that and use that to our advantage in the workplace. So why do we want to study the imagination? Well, because it's the source of creativity and ultimately of innovation. And we all know that's the buzzword of the moment, right? Innovation. We're told we have to innovate, that the next productivity gains are going to come from innovation. Well, it's easy to say, but it's hard to know how you're going to make that happen. And the starting point for that is the imagination. So we'll be talking about that today, how to access it, how to train it up, and how to be able to switch between modes where you can take advantage of both ways of operating cognitively to solve challenging problems. And I think in the new economy, at the moment, everybody needs to understand how this works to give yourselves a competitive advantage, of course, and to get the most out of your people too. It's very, very important. So that's where we're going with the talk. Just to give you an idea of the timeline, this is a 2-hour session, but we'll only talk for at most an hour, and then we're going to hand over to a Q&A. And we'd love to have as many questions as possible from all and everyone here. After about 15 or 20 minutes of that, we've got a lovely catered breakfast and tea and coffee, and we can move outside, and then we'll be moving around talking to as many of you as possible at that time.
So now we know what we're talking about. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and in so doing bring respect to elders past and present. So I commenced to practice in visual art and visual language in 1994. 22 years it's been since I have been either making pictures, talking about pictures, or helping people to externalise their inner visions so that what they're holding in their imaginations and their minds can be put externally into a piece or a form of communication. Probably about just under 3 years ago, I bought that same technique of teaching people where I had been working at the University of Sydney in the visual arts department, and I recognised that it was a really key skill that was missing in the workplace environment, this ability to be able to visualise and externalise what is in your mind. So part of what we will be talking about this morning is the experience that I bring from a 22-year career in visual language.
And I'm David Alais. I'm Professor of Experimental Psychology at the University of Sydney. I've been working for over 20 years in the field of neuroscience, and my particular interest is in how we create our visions of the world, how we perceive the world around us, how all that information we take in through our senses is combined to create a representation of what's out there, and how inner visions feed into that, external sensory information, everything that feeds into representing the world. I've spent probably 10 years of my career overseas working in the US and in Europe, in France and in Italy, in research institutes, and now back in Australia at the University of Sydney. And I'll hand over to Kelly to lead off, and
So, we can get started.
Here we go.
It's the green button. So the imagination doesn't really need an introduction. We know what it is, but in real terms, it is the ability to see what is not present or actual or material in front of us. So the imagination is the ability to see inside the mind as opposed to a reality outside. Now, we all have the ability to do this. It's just that some of us are more exercised, if you like, in being imaginative. And the reason for this is because we do it more often. It's almost like using a muscle. So what we're going to be doing as we go through and we look at what the imagination is finding ways that we can use seeing internally as opposed to externally. Actually, we really want to do both. So if I gave you a book, each and every one of you a book, and I asked you to imagine what that book would be, because this book has empty pages, what we would find is that we all would have completely different books. We'd have different titles, we'd have different chapters. Everything would be different because what creates an idea is an individual. So all of us with our individual capacities to imagine is what innovation, is what new ideas, is what possibility is. So when we think of a blank book, it's really a metaphor for possibility. So what we want to do is give people the skills to write and define from their imagination new books. It's important to distinguish the difference between creativity and imagination because they're actually not the same. I tend to interpret a definition of creativity in the same way that Leonardo da Vinci does, and he sees it as demonstration. So in this sense, the idea that creativity would be experimentation, exploring, combining, playing with things is, more an action-based process. The ability to think up an idea is separate to that. That's imagination. And so when we look at innovation and wanting to innovate workplace cultures and wanting to innovate in general, it's pretty tricky to ask people to innovate because we're not really taking it back far enough. What we need to do is to work on the imagination. If we can work on people's imagination, they will become creative because that's just a process of combining, testing and trying, and then therefore you will get the innovation that we're seeking. Yep.
Well, it's interesting to talk about the imagination from an artistic point of view, but what about from the point of view of neuroscience? What do we know about the imagination? If you'd asked this question about 10 years ago, the answer would have been we really don't know much at all. But there's been a very active area of research lately on a thing called the default mode network, which you can see on the right side. And it's a fairly newly discovered network that's actually sometimes called the imagination network or the creativity network. And it's characterised by certain features. It has a very loose sort of fuzzy logic and very wide-ranging ability to make associations. So in a nutshell, it's quite creative, and we can contrast that with the other network shown there, which is what's known as the attentional, the executive attention network, and that's the one that keeps us focused on tasks. So during most of our working day, we're busy doing things. We've got a to-do list. We've got tasks to do. It's the executive attention network that switches you onto task and keeps you on track. And we're all very good at that, all right? We're trained from the beginning through our schooling, right through our university and workplace practices, always to be focused and on task. It's a very logical, constrained network, and it serves a great purpose, of course, but it's not loose enough to be insightful and to come up with creative insights. It's very interesting how they discovered this network too. As I said, it's fairly recent. Neuroscientists love putting people in brain scanners and giving them tasks to do and seeing what part of the brain lights up. And you change the task and a different part lights up. Someone had the bright idea to put people in a scanner and tell them to do nothing at all. And the assumption was that, well, the brain would just go quiet. There's no sound, no vision, you're not doing anything. And very surprisingly, that's what came out of it. And it was very repeatable. It was there in everybody. This very strong network activity emerged in unexpected ways. And it turns out that it's there in all of us. We all have this imagination network, and it only comes online when you're doing nothing. When you're deeply relaxed, it becomes active. And of course, we're not deeply relaxed while we're working. We're busy being productive and task-focused. That's the other network. But if we do, at moments of deep relaxation, this network comes online, and that's where we benefit from this broader scope of creativity and association. So we all have both networks, and so when people say, well, I'm just not the creative type, it's not actually true, because we all have that network. The problem's more this. The problem is that the executive attention network dominates. It's so highly trained and so strongly formed that it just dominates everything, and it's hard to access this other network. If we can, then we can benefit from its creative insights, its loose, broad-ranging associativity. And so the challenge really, and we'll talk about this later, but this is really the challenge, is how to balance these two networks so that we can bring both sides of this process to bear on our challenging problems and solving problems, yeah? We've got this creative network, we just need to train it up and give it a bit more input into solving complicated problems. I'll get back later to how we can do that, and meanwhile, Kelly-Ann will take over.
So, now we're going to take a look at the visual mind. 93% of all that we understand is visual. We read visuals 60,000 times faster than text. Upwards of 75% of us are visual thinkers. In fact, I would go as far as to say everybody in this room is a visual thinker, and that's what attracted you to being here. So, what is the visual mind? Well, the visual mind is what we see. It's what we do when we're looking at something, which doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see. It's what we observe. We need to get better at doing this, believe it or not. But another part of the visual mind is what we imagine. It's projecting into the future. It's memory. It's daydreaming. Of course, it is imagination. It's insight. So there is a whole other series of visual capabilities that we're not tapping into to use to our full benefit.
The visual mind is indeed extremely powerful, and just how powerful was illustrated in this experiment by Pasquale Leone at Harvard University. He had a bunch of people, divided them into two groups, and put some of them in front of a piano and said, and put them through a half-an-hour session of training twice a day for a week. And after practicing twice a day for a week, he put them in a brain scanner, and he showed demonstrable improvements and changes in neuroplasticity, evidence of learning that these people had learned in very specific ways as a result of their piano practice. The interesting thing was he had this other group, and they were told, just sit in front of the piano and imagine that you're playing the piano. Visualize, imagine that you're playing the piano. They didn't actually do anything physically. And the amazing thing was that when they scanned those patients, they found very similar patterns of learning had taken place just by imagining, right? And one of the reasons that that's possible is that we have this incredibly rich capacity visually in our brains, right? You may have heard the brain is the most complex thing in the known universe, okay, with 1 quadrillion connections in it. It's really incredibly complicated. But the most complex thing it does is vision, all right? And if you colour code all the visual areas that are involved in vision, and if you peel off that cortex and lay it flat, like you can see on the right side, all those coloured areas are involved in vision. Collectively, they're what make us see. And you can see there very starkly, it's about 40% of the cortical area is just involved in making us see. It's the biggest task that the most complex known machine does, right? And we can tap into that, in fact, because we have this capacity to self-generate vision. So those people who were playing the piano were just visualising and tapping into this visual system and creating realistic internal representations of what the other guys were actually doing physically. And when you self-generate visual content, and we can all close our eyes and imagine, I guess the surprise to know is that it really does activate visual cortex and reverse the direction of signal flow. So Normally, there on the left side there's an eye. Input from the eye goes all the way to the back of the brain, occipital cortex, and then goes forward to the frontal cortices through a couple of different pathways. So there's what we call a bottom-up pathway, okay, from the eye to the occipital cortex and up this hierarchy to frontal cortex. When you imagine or visualise, there's literally a reversal of direction. This image on the right, that's from a very recent paper that used some very clever technology to show literally a change of direction of signal flow in these temporal parietal areas shown in red. If you're experiencing external vision, the blue arrows would be the signal direction, but when you close your eyes and visualise, there's actually a reversal of flow through these temporal areas back to the primary visual cortex. And you can also look at this another way. Here's some brain scan images. On the top, you can see the two halves of the brain, the two lateral views on the top. When someone looks at a house, very specific parts of the brain light up. And in this experiment, they put patients in a scanner and they said, now close your eyes, I want you to imagine a house. So the images on the bottom row show again the same two hemispheres. While they're now eyes closed, there's no activation of their primary visual areas, their eyes are closed. Any activity now is purely imagined. And the interesting thing is, I think you'll agree on the top, there's a very particular distribution of information. And that same distribution of information is present in the bottom when they're just imagining the house. And if you imagine something else, you'll actually get a different pattern of activity because the brain's very specifically tuned to very different features. In the next slide, we're going to look at what happens when you view a house, and you'll see the image is slightly different on the top. But if you look at the bottom, again, very close overlay spatially of activity in the bottom where they're imagining a face versus activity in the top where they're actually viewing it. So that tells us that when you self-generate images, you actually feed back, and you don't just in some general way turn up the whole visual cortex. It's highly selective for the features that make up a house or a face, for the edges, the orientations, the colours. It's all very selective. And essentially, with 40% of the brain being devoted to vision, if you can train up this capacity to visualise, then you've really got this enormous computational hardware there that you can use to help enrich your visions, and you can really sort of piggyback off that in very specific ways. And it's a trainable skill that can be upskilled.
Okay, so now we know for sure that the biggest part of the real estate dedicated in our brains to learning and comprehension and existing and imagining and looking and seeing and exploring, all these capabilities come from the visual mind. And what we don't have in a workplace environment and in schools for the people here from the Department of Education is this skill to teach people how to better harness and use and work with and develop their visual mind, because this is such a powerhouse of potentiality in each and every single one of us. What happens by not doing this is that we have thoughts and ideas and inner vision, and we're seeing things, and all of this is just swirling around and around and around, and we're not executing it. We're not exercising it in a way that's going to actually help us. So what we really want to be able to do is to give people skills where they can externalise 93% of the information that they're actually taking in. You see, information overload is happening to all of us more and more because we have so much information that we have to take in. If it's not a text message, it's an email. If it's not an email, it's a meeting, it's a brainstorming session, it's a plane we've got to catch. There is so much information coming into our minds, and information overload happens when a processing unit, be it a human being or a computer, is unable to process that information. So, if we are overwhelmed by information, we're not going to be performing at our best. So what teaching people how to externalise their ideas visually does is it helps them to find the parts and the patterns. And why that is so important is because we can use that to remove the irrelevant chatter in our mind because, it takes up too much of our processing power. I just want to show you what that looks like. Did you take all of that in and enjoy it? Okay, well, I'll give it to you in a different way. So being able to actually see the relationship in terms of area size of one country in comparison to Australia is instantly identifiable to you. It wasn't in that chart. While you had all of that other information there, you were trying to work it out. What's this? What does it mean? What do I do with it? This is boring. Is this what we have to do now? Oh, really? And then when you see this, it just happens instantly. So imagine if we gave people these skills. Imagine if people were able to use their visual mind to process information and communicate. You see, the person who can define the problem or solution and see its parts, the person who can show others what that problem or solution is, will be the person that resolves it. So now I'm just going to bring you to some issues that stop this process of being able to think visually and imaginatively, and that is what we call blind thinking. So what I noticed, having come from a more artistic, creative environment in art schools and studios, and then moving into a more professional environment, were that there was some really obvious blocks to developing these capabilities in people. And one is heuristics, which you would all be familiar with the inherent problems with that. Inattentional blindness, control, judgment and criticism, and concrete thinking. Now, research and studies show that the number one reason people don't present ideas is for fear of judgment. So, that's something we need to iron out in workplace environments. But blind thinking is a zip on the brain. It stops it from opening. And what happens is we stop to be able to see other solutions and other ways of doing things, because the more we habitually think a thought, the more we're burning roads into our mind that become the obvious roads that we take. And so it doesn't become obvious to us to sort of move off into another direction or try something new. But we can use metaphor and visual language to help people, see more opportunities and take different paths. Colgate did some really remarkable ads, which you might want to have a look at online later. So who saw what was wrong with that image? What? Something in the tooth. Who saw the thing in the tooth? Who saw something else? What did you see? Aha. Who saw the hand? Okay. Now do you see it? You see, one of the big problems that we have is that we're not trained. It's not actually our fault. We're just not trained as a species to look for things that are not obvious to us. So, this is the reason we're not allowed to text and drive and all these kind of things. So we can help people to see more. We call it the object and the surround. So when we're teaching people to think visually, we teach them to look at the object, of course, and what is obvious, but then we teach them to look at the surround. And you can think about the potential in that because, even if you're reading a report or anything, it's part of the imagination. Being able to see things that are not obvious to you means investing in a part of your thinking and your brain that is looking for things that it can't see in the external world, but internally. This is part of the imagination. And of course, we're always trying to move our cultures from concrete thinking to flexible thinking, and everybody here, I'm sure, is aware of the difference between convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Divergent thinking, of course, is creativity in a sense. It's what we associate with creativity, imagination. Some call it lateral thinking or expansive thinking. the opposite of which is deductive, vertical thinking or convergent thinking. Now, we are actually trained to think like this. This is how we build our pathways, our neural pathways in the mind. And what we do is we take the information that is available to us, like the bit of stuff in the teeth, and we deduce from it to come to a single best answer. This is highly problematic in terms of innovation and imagination because we're not looking for multiplicity. We're not looking for multiple ways of exploring an idea or a concept. What's really fantastic is you can go back to your teams today and say, look, bring me back 3 different ways we can deal with this. I want 3 solutions. Immediately by doing that, you set people up to start bringing in more and more information available to them. So they will start to take the surround. That's analogous to the hand on the arm. So we can help people become more divergent in their thinking very, very quickly. We need to be flexible. We need multiplicity. We need all of these things. So another way of looking at it is that vertical thinking is selective, lateral thinking is generative. Rightness is what matters in vertical thinking, but richness is what matters in lateral thinking. And again, here's another way of looking at exactly the same concept, which might be really easy to understand if it's in a picture. We really don't want one single road or pathway. We want multiplicity. Multiplicity is generative. It means we'll be looking for more in the external world and we won't reduce things to one single way of doing it because that could be erroneous. Imagine what we're missing out on. So this is also a great metaphor for neuroplasticity because neuroplasticity is the ability to redesign our brains, which of course is possible, we know that for sure. And we can build as many roads and as many connections as we want to. The choice is actually ours.
Well, Kelly-Ann mentioned neuroplasticity, and I think most of you have heard about that, and there's different ways we can modify the brain. Existing connections can be strengthened or weakened, new connections can be formed, old connections broken, and what have you. Even in some cases, new cells created, neurogenesis. But through this process, we can effectively have a say in sculpting the brain because we can so vividly imagine things. And every time you have a thought or an idea, every memory, it's all a collection of cells co-activating. And every time cells co-activate, they tend to strengthen their connections between them. And so that slide's just showing one connection between dendrites of 2 cells coming together. If they're co-activated, then that connection there, circled in red, gets stronger. Simply by repetition. It's really no different to sports training or training a tennis serve or something or a golf swing. By repetition, you strengthen the pathways. And since we have this capacity to visualize, especially if we can access this default mode network, then really we can envisage what we want to create or how we want to visualize. And the mere act of that does generate neural activity, as we saw on the previous slides. And in doing so, strengthens that whole visualization process. I've got some fascinating things to show on this next slide. At a cellular level, you can actually see connections being made between individual brain cells. Here it comes. You're going to see a cell body and some connections, some dendrites branching out and connecting. That's the moment an idea, a connection is reinforced right there. And that's going on all the time in the brain. Every time you co-activate, whether it's a physical action, an idea or a thought, there's a whole lot of neurochemistry going on there that sends these connections towards each other, and then they connect and they strengthen with repetition and end up becoming stronger and stronger and more dominant. And so that process happens when we see things, okay? We see things and there's an association in our brain and connections are made. This is the same thing at a network level. You can see several cell bodies there and a whole mishmash overlay of dendritic arbors there, all connecting up. But we can make up our own mind in a sense, because it doesn't have to be external input that drives these connections. We can get into our default mode network and imagine and visualise and actually create connections and new thoughts ourselves. So that's the sense in which Kelly-Ann said we really can fine-tune our brain, sculpt it. We can't create something out of nothing, but we can shape and form and mould what we have. And we can prune back strong habits or dominant processes like that, or form, here's a memory being formed right there in hippocampal cortex. And so at this cellular level, there's all this incredible connectivity going on. And that's, you've heard of neuroplasticity, everyone's heard of it, but the point to take home here is that if we can enhance our imaginations and visualise, then we can drive that learning process ourselves and have a say in shaping our minds and our creativity.
So what we need to do is start to learn to see more connections and to choose to make new pathways in our mind. And the great news is we can, and we can do it right now. It's instantaneous. So Leonardo da Vinci said, learn how to see, realise everything connects with everything else. So what happens a lot of the time is we go to these events like this morning and people explain and define things to us and, diagnose the problem and the symptoms. We know that. But are there solutions to this? Are there things that we can actually do that can change the brain, make us more imaginative, more innovative and more flexible in our thinking? Yes, there are. And we can also measure how much people see as well. Now, this particular experiment is done by Canon, but it's been done all over the world, and you can, do any of the research you like on this. But what we can do is track people's eye movements. And if you have a look at the image at the top here, it's of an elderly man in what appears to be blue overalls with a hat on, sitting in perhaps a shed. So the eye movements tracked on the computer show how long and where people look. So a non-photographer will, have a look at the scene and go, yep, I've seen that. That's all the information I need to take in from this. A student of photography will take in more, and obviously a pro photographer will take in a lot. Now, this is not really to define the difference between, photographers and, non-photographers. What this does is show that some people spend more time looking at things and retrieving information from it. So it makes sense that if you're trained to look for more and observe more, you will find more information, you will build new neural pathways in your mind, which means you've got more data to connect dots with and therefore become more innovative. Leonardo da Vinci really doesn't need an introduction, just like the imagination, but let's just briefly talk about some of his visions: the aircraft, the helicopter, the bicycle, the watch, and hell, the Mona Lisa. So, he saw a lot of really great things. He said in order to think like him, you had to learn how to see, and you needed these principles. These principles are absolutely vital at a cultural level. So for those of you here who are looking at ways to innovate and develop more flexible thinking and more innovative environments in your organisations, this is a scaffolding you essentially need. The first one is creativity, which he called demonstrazione, which is what we discussed earlier. What's interesting about this is that he also included being willing to make mistakes and learn from them. So everyone who's on this big innovation push will know that part of the mantra is making mistakes. Da Vinci actually in the 1400s put that in with creativity. Sfumato means, direct translation, up in smoke, which is ambiguity. So even in the 1400s, he realised that ambiguity was a problem and it was something that we need to deal with, which I'm sure everybody knows about as well. He spoke about ambidexterity and how important it is to combine both art and science together, and that's precisely what we're doing today. We are using all parts of our brains to receive information in an artistic and scientific way. Then he had corporalità, which is body and mind, and of course most of you would be engaged in having mindfulness or less stress-based practices in your workplace environments, and learning to see. Sensazione, he said that we needed to use more of our our senses, all of them, but particularly the sense of sight and curiosity, and we know that as well. So really nothing has changed at all since the 1400s. The processes that we're using to develop more imaginative minds and more innovative solutions and workplaces are essentially exactly the same. And the creative ideation process would be familiar to most of you as well. We have preparation and saturation, incubation, illumination, insight and verification. So preparation and saturation is where you take in all the information you possibly can and start defining what the problem is. The period in between is the incubation and illumination, where you sit with that uncertainty and you wait for the answer. Insight is that proverbial moment we have in the shower, or a bike ride, or just as you're waking up in the morning, where it comes. And then, of course, verification is where we start drawing it out and working out how we're going to build this thing. So what may not be familiar to you is that these are actually all visual processes. So the process of preparation and saturation is look, see, observe. Ambiguity and meditation and visualization are processes that we can use to aid the incubation and illumination process. And making thoughts visible helps with the insight and also the verification process. So we can run through this in a really easy way if we have a better handle of our visual minds. So how do you do it? Well, at the expense of offending some people here, it's definitely not by Play-Doh, Lego, or playing the guitar in the office. I'm getting some nods here. That would have to be the worst way. In fact, I can see somebody in the audience. 2 weeks ago, I was asked to imagine an animal, and then I was asked to imagine that animal smiling, and then I was asked to stand up and face the person next to me and pretend to be that animal. And that woman is in the room, and we looked at each other and we said, no, we're not going to do this. So nice to see you here. People don't want to be put on the spot like this. Using Lego, asking 50-year-old highly experienced people to use Lego to solve a problem is not going to work. So what can we do? Well, we need to teach people how to use things like metaphors. We need to teach people how to externalise their ideas. We need to teach people about a place that hypothetically exists where everything exists. Because guess what? We don't know that it doesn't. We don't know for a fact, and nobody here can prove, that there is a place where everything that could possibly exist does exist. It just hasn't been revealed, like penicillin. Penicillin always existed, we just hadn't uncovered it. So when you anchor people in a place of possibility and you start to deal with the zip on their mind and you give them things that feed their imagination, they will start making new connections and they will start using their imagination. So it's a process of linking a program like the one that we run, which is the Imaginate program. It's having a culture, a workplace culture that celebrates things like curiosity and mindfulness and all the things that we already know about, outlined by Da Vinci. And then it's following that creative ideation process. When you get that balance right, you will provide an environment where flexible, imaginative thinking thrives.
Well, Kelly-Ann was talking about creativity, and I said earlier that creativity was tightly linked with this newly discovered network, the default mode network. Here's a scan that illustrates that. Kelly-Ann was talking about divergent thinking, which is one of the common ways we try to tap into people's creativity. And on the left two pictures, you can see, look at the first one on the left, that's a medial view of a cortex, and you can see someone here doing a divergent thinking task where they're trying to think of as many uses as possible of a particular object. Yeah? And you see very strong activity in prefrontal cortex on this lateral surface and also at the back, PCC, posterior cingulate. And those are the two key areas there highlighted on the left that I also showed you before on the default mode network. They're shown with the black surround. That's the two key areas of the default mode network, and creativity engages those. So that's what I meant when I said that this is really an imagination and creativity network. And so the question is, how do we access it? Because I also said it's not dominant in most of us, and actually it sort of gets made dormant during the day when we're all busily doing our tasks. So how do we activate it? Well, one simple way to activate it is by slowing down the brain a little bit. And an effective way to do this is with mindfulness. Now, along with things like innovation and neuroplasticity, mindfulness is a buzzword at the moment too. Everyone's heard of it. But it's really very simple. It's just a form of meditation, a very simple form of meditation where on the one hand you're relaxing, and on the other hand you're maintaining an inner focus on something very simple, such as just the rise and fall of your breathing. And it's more than just relaxation, it turns out. It's that maintaining your inner attention on the breathing that's really the key ingredient that we've discovered. Because actually, just as it's a buzzword, I think generally, neuroscientists lately have really got into researching mindfulness. And I think a lot of people used to be skeptical about it, that it was some Eastern kind of Zen thing. It's not really science. And you wouldn't believe it now, there are so many studies done showing that what mindfulness does all sorts of amazing things to the brain. And indeed, very short programs of training can dramatically change your brain, thicken parts of the cortex, change predominant function activity in the frontal cortex from right side to left side, which is a signature of improved mood and affect. It does all sorts of things. The lists of benefits are enormous. And particularly what's relevant for our benefit, for our purposes, is that mindfulness slows down the brain so that you can access the default mode network. I'm not seeing the same slide. Can we go to the next slide, Ewan? There we go, thank you. What you see at the top is that jagged trace is a recording from the brain taken from a scalp electrode. It's a complex wave. That's what's going on in the brain all the time, all sorts of activity. But in that complex wave, there's all sorts of important bands that do different things functionally. Further down below, you can see that top trace that I've smoothed out a bit. That's called the beta band. And this, when you're focused on doing things during your day, that band of frequencies becomes very active, and the dominant band in that complex wave on the top. And when you're giving a lecture like I am, or when you're running through some Excel figures, or when you're running a meeting, you're being task focused and there's high beta activity. The problem is you won't access your default mode network until you can slow down the brain to the next band of frequencies beneath that, which is called the alpha band. And some of you will know about that. That's the band you're in when you're deeply relaxed. All right? How do you get into that deeply relaxed state? Well, it can be difficult at work, of course. There's so many things we have to do, but a short mindfulness exercise is one of the things that will slow your brain down. If you spend 10 minutes just quietly with your eyes closed, relaxing and focusing on breathing, you can slow down the brain, so to speak, so that these oscillations in the alpha band become dominant. And at that point, you're activating your default mode network. You've turned off this sort of domineering, externally oriented executive attention network. Of course, if you keep turning down these waves, you eventually fall asleep. Those lower two waves are what happens when you're deeply asleep. But there's alpha bands in between sleep and dreaming and task-focused activity. And mindfulness will get you into that state. And if you're not doing something to relax, and it doesn't have to be mindfulness, but you've got to do something to slow down the brain, or you won't get into that network state to begin with.
What's interesting about that state is that Nikola Tesla, who of course invented electricity for all of us to use, the poles and wires, he used to sit on his chair, and he didn't know about the alpha state, but he would hold a ball in his hand and wait till the ball fell out of his hand, and then he knew that was when he needed to start visioning and creating. So he actually knew that that was the peak point of doing it, but not why. So let's be honest, mindfulness is a great idea, and we know how powerful and, wonderful it is, but how many of you here struggle with it? I don't believe that there's not more strugglers with it. How many people practice mindfulness? Oh, okay. Fabulous. So if you do struggle with it, and for those of you who are responsible for getting more and more people in the workplace to engage in it for the obvious reasons that we know about, we have developed a process which is called SIMR, Subconscious Image Reinforcement. And what this does is uses alpha waves through an MP3, which you can download, which takes you through a mindfulness process, then a visualization process. What's really fantastic about this is you can design it to suit your own purpose. So if what you wanted to do was to create environments that were well prepared for, say, some change that was coming on, or, what's that word? If you wanted to create a situation where people were able to adapt well to anything at all, you could organise to have a pre-recorded narrative made into an alpha state that people could use at their own time and start to recreate and redraw their brains.
The SIMR product is actually very simple, and it's based on this idea of physical entrainment. There was a fascinating experiment done 350 years ago by a Dutch physicist. He had 2 pendulum clocks and he set them oscillating like this and went home for the evening, and the next day he came back and they were in synchrony. And that's physical entrainment, that two oscillating systems that can interact, and these ones interacted through waves, through air particles. It was a very subtle interaction, but it was enough to entrain them. And in fact, listening to these binaural beats that are at the heart of this SIMR idea is just a neural form of entrainment. We know that you have all these waveforms going on in your brain. The question is to select the right band and amplify that so that you can get into this alpha state that you need to be creative to activate your default mode network. So the easy way to do it, if you're not particularly excited about mindfulness, you can put on some headphones and you can hear these alpha waves, and that will entrain and amplify the alpha band signals in the neural signals that are ongoing all the time, and help put you into that state. It'll direct you and get you there much faster. One thing I was going to mention just before too was that mindfulness, people don't like doing it. People say, oh, I feel so much better when I do it, and blah, 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 and we've all heard that. The skeptics say, well, if I spent 20 minutes with, relaxing, I'd feel better too. And that's a very good point, and one that deserves to be put to the test. And neuroscientists, I told you there's now a wealth of research on this, and people have done that. They've got groups of people randomly assigned to 2 groups. One group's taught a relaxation method, 20 minutes a day for, say, 6 or 8 weeks. Another group is specifically taught mindfulness, not just relaxation, but mindfulness. They go through the process for the 8 weeks, and then they do these brain scans and record their neural activity. And relaxation is good for you, I won't lie about that, it is, but there are so many more benefits from mindfulness. You don't get these plastic changes, you don't get these changes in cortical thickness in the front left, frontal lobe, you don't get all these numerous changes, and there are so many, you just don't get them from relaxing. There's something very special about mindfulness, and it's all based on this maintaining your focus on your breathing, not letting your attention wander. And the benefit there is when you come back to work, you end up, and again it's training, it's neuroplasticity, you end up getting very good at maintaining your attention. You can focus better, you're more productive. You can exclude those thoughts and worries that you have from a meeting that went badly yesterday or some terrible thing you're going to have to do later. So, mindfulness really does work, and it's not just relaxing. But if you don't like it, this product can help you get there. And help you, of course, rebalance. So I said at the beginning, you have these 2 networks, the one on the left, the one on the right, completely different networks. You can see they occupy completely different parts of the brain. How can we access this default mode network? through mindfulness or a product like Simmer. The more you access it, the better you get, the louder that network's going to get. It's a very, it's outweighed, as I said, by the activity from the executive attention network. But the more you access it, the more developed it gets, the stronger it gets. And that's a good thing. And ultimately, it leads to more insights. And just to wrap up my section of the talk, let me talk about the cognitive style of people who are imaginative and creative. What do we know about them? If you take imaginative, creative people and you study their cognitive habits and compare them against another group that's also very high achieving, they're just not particularly creative, what do you notice? Well, the first thing you notice is something quite counterintuitive. You would think, wouldn't you, that imaginative, creative types would have a strong inner focus. In fact, they're very externally focused. They are, like the trained photographer that we saw before, looking at an image and their eyes are flicking about, extracting every idea and relationship possible. Right? They're very curious and externally focused. And that's your executive attention network. We're all good at that. That's what we're trained to do. But specifically, we need to train ourselves to observe, like that trained photographer. Because you can't create until you've got a whole lot of information in there. Creativity is really just assembling pieces in new, innovative ways. Well, the more pieces you've got in there, the more you can find a unique solution, right? It's like you can't make much out of Lego if you don't have many pieces. So you need to observe, take in as much as you can. Okay, that's very important. That's external focus, and that's learning to really see, which Kelly-Ann was talking about before. So they're externally focused, but they're also, I guess they have a good sort of, you might say, work-life balance, these guys. They know when to turn off and to do something else. Right? They know that you're trying to solve a problem, you can grapple with it and read and study and do whatever you have to do, fill your head, lay the groundwork, but at some point you have to turn off and do something else. This is this incubation period that Kelly-Ann talked about, and it's extremely important. So you might think it's downtime. Someone who's really, process-driven, task-oriented might think, well, that's just a waste of time, that's downtime, I've got work to do. It's not really downtime. If this idea is really important to you, unconsciously, you're still working it over, right? It's incubating. And it's not so much downtime, it's actually uptime for your default mode network, right? It needs this time, and it needs to be relieved of all this, domination of the executive attention network. So that's very important. They know when to turn off. So they're highly external observant, they know when to turn off, and they're very skilled at getting into this alpha state, right? Into relaxing and turning inwards. So they actually are inner-oriented people, but selectively. They do both. They move from external focus to internal, right? When they turn inwardly, that's when they can access the thoughts of their imagination, their creativity network. And that speaks with a very soft voice. You don't hear it, right? And as long as you've got your eyes open and you're busy on task, there is so much visual activity coming in through your eyes, driving 40% of your brain, that all you see and respond to are the images and the things and the demands right in front of you on your desk. You've got to be able to slow down and stop that external focus from dominating. And creative, imaginative people can do that, right? That's a skill that needs to be trained up and learned. And so in a nutshell, I guess, what I want to say is, from a neuroscience point of view, we all do have an imagination. And that's become clear in the last 8 to 10 years. The question is, it's massively outweighed by our highly trained executive network. So the challenge is learning how to access our imagination network, training it up, and then learning the skill of switching between the two networks to get the most out of our ability to work with problems and solve problems. If we can do that, we're really getting the best of both worlds. Right? 2 heads are better than 1 when you're trying to solve a problem. And you really do have, as it were, 2 minds in there ready to put to work. And so that's the challenge. Learning to access, training it up, and learning to switch.
So, in summary, we all have the capacity to be more imaginative. And there are major benefits to this, because what it essentially means is that we will see more possibilities, we will work in environments that are more flexible, and it's something that we need to invest in. I found out on Monday morning that at Laddison is now giving every employee half a day a week dedicated to imagining. And I know GE does something similar. So they've already worked out that imagining is a really vital skill that we need to help people get to and achieve. And yeah, we want new products and services and, you know, engineering triumphs, of course we do. But we also need to use the imagination so that people can just solve minor problems in a workplace situation. So people get on better. They find a few different ways of dealing with a tricky situation. So what we also now know is the way to access that is through the visual mind, a major untapped potential that we have. 40% of our real estate in our brain. The visual mind is the ability to observe more and learn how to see, but it's actually also the exercising of those internal seeing processes like inner vision, memory, imagination, daydreaming, all of those things. So the visual mind is a massive, complete package that we're really not using. And if we do, as David has suggested, and spend more time balancing out from our logical executive attention network and move more into a default mode network and actually make time to do that via processes of just using simmer or mindfulness, we will start to build the neural pathways we need in our mind to see more potential and more realities. And then if we have great skills in externalizing these and communicating these in a way, we retain 83% of what we see. We retain 20% of what we read. So what is all our data? It's literature. So if we have the skills that actually allow us to prioritise, see the parts, find the patterns, and then externalise and use those to communicate with people, we will be innovating. So thank you very much, and we'll now open it up to any questions.
There's people walking around with microphones. If you have a question, just raise your hand and
Okay,
I'll
there's
pass
one
it.
up here.
Where?
Hi, look, I agree with all you're saying and I understand what you're saying. And it sounds like we're creating a whole new mind, a whole new brain, and we want to take it into organisations that are still have old structures. So it's really an old mind trying to work in an old structure, and that's what doesn't work. So we need more places like Atlassian who are creating those new structures to accommodate this whole new mind. So I suppose my question is, how are organisations changing to their structures to accommodate this whole new mind, and are they open to it?
I think leadership is really key here, and somebody has to go first and try doing it a new way. And I noticed that the advisor to the Minister for Innovation is here today. I've heard quite a few times directive come from him that says something along the lines of, I want you to come back with something I've never seen before. I want something new. So if you've got really great leadership, somebody who's prepared to make the call and say, I want to see something I haven't seen before, I want to try something new, and they're prepared to take responsibility for that, good or bad, they will lead people into being more courageous in trying new things. Because the old structure is safe, but what we all know as we journey through this ideas boom and this innovation age that we're moving into is someone has to go first. And that's you guys. You guys are the leaders.
I would say too, in response to your question, that sometimes I think we set the bar too high. We say, okay, create or innovate, as if that can just be done. It's a process and it starts much earlier. And developing imagination is part of that. You've got to lay some groundwork before you can create. In terms of work practices, I don't think you have to have your staff lounging in bean bags, working on their laptops, and have a breakout room where you can play hacky sack or ping pong. right? You can, I think, if you've that might work fine for a new company that's set up relatively recently and targets a young demographic as staff. But I mean, if you've inherited a traditional workplace arrangement, you don't need to make that many changes, I don't think, to incorporate it. You've just got to, as you were saying, it's really fear of judgment that is one of the biggest things, in these brainstorming sessions where everyone has to contribute an idea that are often incoherent because no one's in their inner vision followed through a process to the end. You get a very incoherent mess. I just think we need to, prioritise people, training up their imaginations and give them time to develop ideas. The formal deadlines are very counterproductive because that's stress, and stress is the enemy of creativity. That narrows focus. There's actually some simple changes can be made to really help in the workplace.
Yes.
Just because I'm next to the person who's holding the mic, maybe I can ask this question. I'm just wondering whether you have any techniques of unlocking creativity and then translating it. For example, how do you actually, after about 10 minutes of mindfulness, and you've got a great idea, I mean, are there any particular techniques of translating that into a particular visual, the way of doing it? I mean, I guess the reason I'm asking is that if you are thinking about, say, a group of children, whom you want to be creative, I mean, often we use the project-based learning type of activities. But then, according to what David was saying, if you are constantly involved in activities and they become more procedural, and so it doesn't really allow you to unlock your brain. So I was wondering, those neuro systems, which is one is more active in more procedural matters, which like the project-based learning, I guess. And then how do you actually get the children? I'm from the Department of Education, so I'm just wondering how do we actually teach creativity to the children? Yeah.
I understand your question. Creativity and teaching creativity is quite a gentle process, and that's why a lot of these sort of rah-rah, singy kind of things don't work. Because what we really need to do is to help people with their conscious mind and their subconscious mind make connections, and it's really quite personal. In fact, if you think about going to an art gallery, a very creative space, it's quite, conservative and it's a quiet process. So if we can give people the skills to see more and observe more in a way that it's very safe for them, and they're not criticised and judged, that's really important because that shuts down. And then we give them the conscious skills to externalise that and to talk about that. They start to synthesise and get into a rhythm where they can start to use their mind in a way that then they can then get more advanced and make connections. They start to build those neural pathways. So actually teaching people to be more creative and imaginative is a process of allowing them to use these two parts of the mind, but also deal with the uncomfort in between. When you're trying to solve a problem or do something, you can very easily get into a panic and stop yourself from solving the problem because you haven't solved it yet and you've got the deadline, you've got all these things. That's a killer. So giving people really good skills to allow themselves to journey through that process, makes it easier for them.
And I would add one thing to that. You mentioned process, and what's underrated in the whole, innovation, creativity story is that it's a whole process, and no one really goes straight to conceiving the ultimate solution, right? All the great things that were invented, all the great paintings that were ever drawn, every artist fills a sketchbook with ideas before they eventually, paint their painting, and you can go to some art galleries in the world and you can see sketches of paintings that were done before the final. It's a process. And actually, once you've got an idea, it's often the germ of a good idea, the beginning. And then the hard work starts. You have to really nut that out and tinker and experiment. And at that point, a whole team can come in. Someone can come, I've got an idea, I think there's something in it and it works a bit like this. But you've got to work on it and experiment and get it just right. So asking people just to create something can be really a big ask. It's a difficult thing to do, and rarely do you get to the final stage first go. So there's a whole process, and that involves some teamwork, some toing and froing, some experimenting.
Just a quick question over here. Sorry, just here. Just wondering, how do you see dreaming fitting into this, and when you're, sleeping, dreaming, how that fits into this process?
Yeah. Sometimes you dream the solution. It occasionally happens, not very often, but sometimes it does. You often, so I showed those graphs of the different, neural oscillations, and when you go to deep relaxation, if you go even deeper than that, you're in sleep now, either deeply asleep with those slow rhythms, and there's phases through your sleep where you become alert and active and you start dreaming. That's at that next level up. It's possible you can come up with a final idea there. I think dreaming is, psychology spent decades trying to figure out what dreaming is, and I think the final idea is that it's simply just the playing out of recent events again, relaying down of memories and things. It's not actually something to really interpret necessarily. If you're lucky, once in a while you do get a great insight. But more often, it doesn't come from the dream, it comes as you wake up. Think of it, you're in this deep sleep and you start gearing up and getting into the alpha state, and then you're fully alert. There's that in-between time, in that first 20 minutes when you're staggering around, as you said, you might be in the shower. Who hasn't had a great idea having a morning shower when you're half asleep? And as soon as you get too alert and too into that beta state and task-oriented, you sort of lose that wild, loose association. Yeah. So it can happen in dreams, but more often coming out of sleep, I would say.
This lady's, this.
Hi, can you talk specifically about the techniques for getting better at expressing visually your ideas? Because that's something I struggle with personally.
Yeah, I like to call it verbal pitching, pitching, as opposed to visual pitching or picturing. You would probably realise that if you wanted to talk about an idea, like for me, for example, today, I needed to get into a practice of actually talking this through and having somebody hear it. So because our subconscious minds they understand symbols and pictures. They don't understand words and language so well. So what we need to really do is to marry up those two things. And in art schools, where you've got people studying, visual things like painting or photography or something, they're really bad at it. So part of the 3 years you spend in art school is learning how to bring out what's in your mind. So the best way to do that is to have a witness, and that witness will understand what you're saying or not understand what you're saying, and then you will start to train yourself to think about what that person needs to know, because what's in your head is clear. Unfortunately, you're not matching it up as well as you would like to, and that comes with experience and having somebody witness what it is that you're trying to say. You'll hear it. People say, or you might even say, I can't see what you mean. Do you get the picture? That's when people are really struggling with what's going on over here to communicate it. So it's practice. And if you have a visual art teacher or somebody who's trained in visual communication, they will be able to see where you're going and will be able to help pluck it out.
Pictorial.
Yes. And some people are audic and kinesthetic. So I think we're usually 2. Is that correct?
Sorry?
We're usually 2, visual and kinesthetic or visual and audic.
Yes, some people aren't, not everyone is extremely visual. Some people, it can help to visualise by anything that helps you interact with it. You can sort of imagine the shape of it and imagine going through the motions of how this thing would work, or you can imagine how it would feel or sound. Anything that brings it to life is helpful. Not everyone's purely visual.
Hi, thank you for that. My name's Aria from Dream Consortium, and I really resonated with the default mode network of, just sitting there and not having any sort of intention and that being creative. My question is around this thing around being in the shower and ideas coming, and that's one scientific connection to that. But I also find when I'm walking or in nature, I've heard nature is a thing where your attention is not anywhere and it's not directive. So again, that's another point. So around that, do you have any data or ideas and comments around external stimulus that helps this process.
Yeah, that's a good point. You don't have to necessarily go into a meditation or, to achieve an alpha state. Actually, it happens several times a day. We just transiently drift into alpha states. You'll be working hard and then you'll just sort of look mindlessly out the window and someone calls you back. You've just transiently gone into that alpha state and you think, oh, I've drifted off. That was your, You can do it by going for a walk, just changing your routine, getting out of the office and doing something different. It can be as simple as getting off the bus 3 stops earlier and walking the rest of the way. You never normally do that. You notice things, Or, I don't know, instead of eating in the office, you walk to the gardens or down to the quay, and just anything that'll mix up the routine is generally helpful. And mindless activities are really good because you don't have to think about them. So anything that's not task-oriented. Most of us can drive without thinking too much. Most of us can, mow the lawn or there's lots of things you do that you don't, ironing or something. I find that pretty mindless, but, you just switch off and you drift off. That's really what you're talking about. You can get into that state in lots of ways. You don't have to make this concerted effort. Right, I'm going to sit down, quiet, turn down the lights, shut the blinds, do my meditation. It doesn't have to be like that. Anything that mixes up is helpful.
And as leaders, you want to help your people get to that place, because the more often they go there, the stronger the pathways they will create in that space, and the more flexible and imaginative they will be. So you have to find ways to do that in an effective way where people aren't slacking off but actually making good use of the time. Yeah.
Here and then there.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, I read on your website about the emotional intelligence, and I wanted to ask you to speak to the fact that invulnerability is really important to allow people to have some trust to go there.
Yeah, I think that, being creative or innovative or imaginative is a place that is achieved if you are authentic and vulnerable and open. While you've got all of these, things going on. The thing is, ideas are ugly. That's what GE says, and the process is a bit ugly, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of scope there to make mistakes. And if we have environments where people don't make, I don't mean make excuses, but what we don't really want to do is make it okay for people like this. We want it to be authentic. Trying new things and doing new things are difficult because you get judged and you can make mistakes, and that makes you vulnerable. And that's actually okay. It's part of the process. Do you know what? In art schools and creative environments, it just goes with the territory. I mean, you spend 3 years every day making stuff and then sitting around in a group and having it critiqued. It's not personal. It's how you build your idea and your vision. But in workplace environments, I don't think that those skills are necessarily built into the structure. And if they were, it would be a little bit more free, and people would not be so fearful of being vulnerable when presenting their ideas.
You have to pick and choose who you're going to create with, I think, too.
Yeah.
Because you want it to be a receptive environment, not too judgmental. I mean, when I think about, for instance, my work and, of the 100-odd papers I've published with colleagues from all around the world, I can think of a couple who I can sit down with and I can just brainstorm, because I know I can say an idea it's a half good idea, but it's a half bad idea. But I know that they'll pick up the half good and kick it back to me with an improvement, which you don't always get with professors, because they're all obsessed with being smart and being right and everything. But it's the same in any workplace. There's going to be people who you can, I suppose, you've got to engender a bit of trust and say, look, I'm giving out half an idea. You can, I guess you can define a time and a place where everyone can go and we can just kick around half-baked ideas. I mean, I guess there's ways to do it. But the vulnerability, I know, it is an issue. There was a question just behind.
I just wanted to go back to some of your comments, around stress and creativity, and just leaving the world of the corporate world, the comfortable corporate world of Sydney. I mean, I work a lot in Asia, in emerging Asia, especially in slums among the poor. And it's not like there is no creativity there. There is a lot of creativity. There is a lot of imagination. And I wonder what's the role of necessity, survival, stress, as a source of creativity, because we seem to say, oh, we just need to be there and creativity. But again, among those people who are fighting to survive, there is a lot of creativity there.
That's a really good point. I guess there are times when you have to find ways to get by, and you have to think laterally. I guess if it was a matter of life and death, you're highly motivated to, find some solution to a food source or a water source or to earn some money. That's highly motivating. And I guess, we do have these two networks. Everyone has them. I guess you're highly motivated in that context to try and use this other one that's going to, think a bit laterally and outside the square and find creative ways to survive, basically. That's...
But in that case, sort of a broad statement that sort of stress is against creativity is not correct.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Stress, as we would commonly... that's deprivation in life or death, I guess. That's a slightly different... Stress, deadlines, pressure, expectations, that sort of stress that we experience in the workplace, that is one of the enemies of creativity, because it just makes us narrow down to that narrow focus. I get your point, though. There's a real imperative to solve a problem, to find food and water in some situations, and that's going to force...
I can give you just a specific example, right? It's just one of many examples. So in Indonesia, for example, there is a law that during certain hours, you need to have at least 3 people in a car to reduce traffic, right? So there is a whole lot of people, poor people, especially mothers with their children, who are sitting on the side of the street at that time so that they can jump into a car and get some money for it, because it's forbidden to have only one or two people in the car. That's very imaginative, right? And the reason they do that is because the mother with their child are, they don't have any money. They don't have any money to feed their children. So they invented a new solution, which would have been which people wouldn't have invented if they wouldn't have the pressure of feeding their children.
The question is, did they come up with that solution in that moment, or had this been the 3rd or 4th time they'd been in this position and the two parts of their mind had been communicating, and then, there was a period in between, an incubation period where, bang, it was starting to come up and rise to the beginning, and then the idea came. So that's an interesting concept, because we don't know whether, this person under duress or stress came up with this innovative solution in that moment, or if this had been a period of time that this had been going on for. Personally, I think stress is the killer of creativity, and it doesn't work for me at all, because my adrenaline's running, I'm busy, I'm focused on 10 things, and I'm not really giving attention to what it is that I need to do. So for me personally, I have to put in procedures in place, so I have to be early. If I'm running late, I forget things and I'm all over the place, and I'm really not creative or innovative at all. I'm actually quite ineffective. So if you know yourself, one of the processes that we teach is called the observer and the observed. So if you can teach people to monitor themselves and work out when they're getting stressed, when they're getting defensive and righteous, they can self-manage and self-regulate through these situations and put themselves in a position where they can be more effective and more creative. So I know there are people who say they're very creative, at the 11th hour and they get brilliant, and I presume some people are, but I would say the majority of people need that processing time and need to have a clear mind in order to receive insights.
We've got a minute or two before we move outside. There's breakfast catered and tea and coffee. A couple of more questions over here.
Just following on from what the gentleman said, I just wonder if you've got any lessons across cultures, comparisons of imagination in different countries. I've actually got 100 questions. But the other one, is there a critical mass in organisations when imagination really takes off? I'm from the Department of Industry, by the way.
Okay.
I would say the cross-cultural question, that is a good question, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't know the answer. I will go away and read up about that. But I do know in terms of critical mass, it makes sense when we talked about laying the groundwork and having a lot of ideas to work with. The more people who bring more ideas, that can create that critical mass. otherwise there's a lot of pressure on the individual to be, hyper observant and learn everything for themselves. No one can do everything. There's a danger of having critical mass is that ideas get thrown together in a sort of, in that typical sort of brainstorming session way where it doesn't hang together as a coherent thing. You do have to train people on their own to work through and come up with a coherent thing. Brainstorming should more be about, I've thought through a whole process to the end and here's what I think would solve the problem. And then someone else throws in, this is my idea of how the process would work. When we just throw out, and call out different ideas and they get written on the butcher's paper, it's no one's coherent vision getting up there and you really can't force it together.
Or mass of people, have you seen countries
small teams?
Small teams,
yes.
Okay. And the other big question is, what is the impact of drugs on imagination?
Oh, it can be really good. No, seriously. What did...
But we don't
Ernest,
suggest you drugging up your workforces.
Ernest
Especially
Hemingway...
between 9 and 5.
No, I've got a lot to say on this point. Ernest Hemingway said, write drunk and edit sober, right? Just get the ideas out there and come back with a straight mind and clean it up. This was your question too, how do you break down the routine, change up the circumstances? Drugs can do that. I'm not advocating that you take drugs, I'm just saying it can definitely be part of the mix. I'm not recommending it, but it does work. Can work.
I just wanted to say in critical... I just wanted to make a point about critical mass as well in workplace environments. There's no point training up a group of people to be innovative. If you've got a small team of horses that you're backing, you're not going to get the energetic shift through the organisation that is going to make you an innovative organisation. And no, I won't give your line away, but it was a very good one in January, Sean. You need to have a whole group of people buzzing and moving in the same way and opening. Because if you've invested in a few people, 10 people, 20 people to be imaginative and innovative, they're going to have to move against the tide of a whole lot of blocked people and you will get nowhere. So this really needs to be a cultural shift as opposed to an elitist, process. Two more questions. Okay, yep.
I was just wondering if you look much in your research or studies into children and their imagination and play and how that would fit into this?
Yes, and we haven't come to, because David proofs everything and then looks for the absolute solid evidence. And there was something that I presented to him recently while he was in Paris that he hasn't proved yet, so we couldn't put it in the talk. But they do say that 7-year-olds predominantly live in the theta state, which is the hypnotic state. So there is a shift that happens after 7 years old where people become obviously less, imaginative. And if we could get to the bottom of that theta state in under 7-year-olds.
My query was specifically with the theta waves, but in general, I would say yes, children are very creative for a number of reasons. One being they're they're not held back by the sort of constraints of reality. They'll have imaginary friends and think that's normal. Some kids have imaginary families. My daughter had imaginary brothers and sisters and aunts. The whole family. I knew where they all lived, and they all had names, right? One thing that happens in the young brain is that it's massively overconnected. Right? There's already about a quadrillion connections in the adult brain, right? Which is 1,000,000 billions. That's a lot of connections. But little kids have even more connections. The brain's born massively overconnected and it slowly prunes back because certain things are reinforced. This is plasticity, as we were talking about. The things that are commonly co-activated by the environment get strengthened up, other connections just fade out. That's the basic neuroplasticity. So early on, while the pruning's still taking place, and it goes up to about 7 years of age, you've got a whole lot more connections. So, a neuron here can be talking to some neuron over there. And as you get older, those connections fade away. And particularly the executive attention network. If you look at the neurons in that network, they have their dendritic arbors, those branches that connect with neighbouring cells, they're smaller and narrower. Right? And because the brain's organised very functionally specific, it's talking to like-minded neurons. Whereas there's some neurons on the right side of the default mode network that have these really large dendritic branches. So you've got a neuron here encoding some concept, and he's talking to a guy over here that encodes something else. And I think that's the sort of thing that young kids have before the pruning process is finished.
Yes.
So my name's John. I'm with the DREAM Consortium as well. And I'm a behavioural change coach, and I work primarily with leaders. And I know that most executive leaders are time poor. So the biggest issue for them is time. And you're sharing about Atlassian and giving half day a week. Most business leaders I know that's not even a possibility. They would get really stressed even contemplating that. But is there a relationship between the amount of time? Like, does it have to be a lot of time that's given to this, or can you do it in short bursts?
I think so.
Yeah, and I know a lot of organisations, they want to try and they're aware of it now. I think there is a shift, and they try and map it into their days. And what some of them have discovered, if you lock out half an hour a day for people to give over to mindfulness, what they do is they cram in fixing other breakdowns or catching up on stuff or other tasks. How do you deal with that?
So the first observation was, does it take a long time? No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to, but it does take some discipline. I mean, you have to be committed to it. I mean, it's like when you go to the doctor and he says, well, the good news is you're not going to die, but the bad news is you need to lose weight and exercise. And you know the message, you know it's true. We don't want to hear it. You have to be committed to the idea that we have these two brain networks, and this one that's often neglected is incredibly productive and insightful. We need to make time for it. You have to commit to it. It doesn't have to be a lot of time, but this idea that it's downtime, that I should use my little mindfulness allocation time to catch up on those emails or something. Yeah, you can do that, but that's just being task-focused to the nth degree. You do have to say, there's another way to work. That downtime is still work time. Like I said, it's uptime for the other side, not the other side, because it's not left, right, but for the other network, right? So it's not downtime, it's uptime, and that's a cultural shift we'll have to get used to. And as you say, people are starting to do it, and I think the benefits are there. You can in half an hour, you can make some incremental steps to finishing your tasks for the day, but you're not going to make a big breakthrough. And you might do if you spend 20 minutes thinking quietly and getting into that other network.
Okay, well, it's time for breakfast. So we can continue on talking out while we're, avoiding this dreadful view and enjoy some coffee and some food. Thank you very kindly for generating your time.